Welcome to Smart Money, brought to you by Daily Investor, South Africa's fastest growing investment publication. And today, Nedbank's Chief Executive Mike Brown joins us. Mike started his career in 1988 as an article clerk at Deloitte, where he was placed into a group that audited, amongst other companies, banks, the sector he was drawn to. In 1993, he joined the Natal Building Society, a small Durban bank that was merged into Boland Bank, which in turn was bought by BOE, and the whole group was acquired by Nedbank. Long story short, Mike has never changed companies since joining the banking world. Instead, he's risen through the ranks quickly, having been appointed as Nedbank's Chief Financial Officer in 2004 and Chief Executive in 2010. Apart from being in charge of one of South Africa's big banks for over a decade, Mike also serves as Deputy Chairperson of Business Leadership South Africa and is Director at the Banking Association South Africa. In 2020, he was selected by his peers as the Sunday Times Top 100 Companies Business Leader of the Year. Thanks so much, Mike, for joining us today. And that's quite a profile that I've just gone through, right? But let's take a step back for a minute. Both your grandfather and your father were bankers, and many assume that's the reason you went into banking. A bit of nature, a bit of nurture coming into play there. Did you always want to be a banker?
And my uncle as well. So you could add to that family tree. And I guess they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But not really, actually. In school, I was fortunate to do reasonably well and was trying to choose, as people then did, between, doctor, lawyer, or chartered accountant. And I guess I was more drawn to business, both through my parents and relatives, but also through some friends at school. And then particularly fortunate, I guess, in that as I joined Deloitte, as you said in the introduction, I was placed into a group that, amongst others, audited financial services entities, of which NBS was one. And in auditing, it gives you a really broad, spectrum of experience. And I audited many different types of companies, but certainly stood back at the end of my 3 years of articles, realizing that it was the sort of complexity and interest and indeed sort of fast-growing and ever-changing nature of financial services that interested me the most. And I've stayed in that industry ever since and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, you've chosen the right path, right? Because not long after you joined the National Building Society, you became CFO and then CE at Nedbank at a relatively young age. What do you ascribe your success to?
It's always tricky in life, and, I guess success in many ways is in equal measures, hard work and good luck. And sometimes, hard work is what's needed, and sometimes good luck is what's needed. I've always ascribed to hard work, tried to make sure that whenever I go to meetings or presentations, etc., I'm very thoroughly prepared. I've done all my reading, whether I'm doing that late at night or early in the morning. I was very fortunate through both school and university to do well academically. I ended up as the best final year student in my University of Natal postgrad year. And so certainly hard work is absolutely central. But alongside that, you also need, a good deal of good luck. And, for me, good luck starting out in an audit group that happened to audit banks. I've had some great mentors that I was lucky enough to have as bosses early on. People like Paul Leifright, later on, Tom Boardman, Vasi Naidu. All of those people have been, hugely beneficial in my career. And then, some good luck in terms of timing. Nedbank eventually having acquired BOE, going through some challenges, and a pretty big change in the Nedbank management team, which gave me an opportunity at a relatively young age to be the CFO. And then, when Tom Boardman retired, it was kind of at the back end of the global financial crisis. And again, I think that was a little bit of good luck for me because, right central in front of mind to all boards at that time would be capital, liquidity, all of those things that were central to the financial crisis. And clearly that was the area of expertise and responsibility that I had at the time. And then I think on top of hard work and good luck, also a hugely supportive wife and home life, without whom I could never, ever have put in the hours required to get to where I have.
Absolutely. Mike, so now over a decade at the helm at Nedbank, right? What would you say have been your biggest successes and the things you're proudest of during your tenure, whether as a result of hard work or good luck?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a number of things. Certainly I would say continuing the good work that, in fact, Tom Boardman started around the centrality of culture and values in any organization, and the importance of the leadership team in ensuring that the right culture and values are role modeled in an organization. So I think I'm extremely proud as to how we've developed that within Nedbank. And alongside that, the depth and breadth of leadership teams that we have in our organization. So, all about people, I think, is something I would look back on extremely proudly. And then if I look at a couple of key events, more recently, how the South African banks in general and Nedbank in particular navigated the COVID lockdown crisis. I think we came through extraordinarily well. And, more particular to Nedbank, we've been on the last 5 or 6 years on a huge technology journey, refreshing the entire technology stack of Nedbank. That is an extraordinarily difficult job to do in a bank while maintaining high levels of uptime and customer satisfaction. And we're nearly finished. We're well over 90% done, and that has gone exceptionally well. So I'm very, very proud of our teams around that. And then finally, I would look back on how we have worked alongside Old Mutual as they followed their managed separation processes. And over the last couple of years, they've gone from 50% ownership of Nedbank down to 3 or 4%, very seamlessly, and both organizations still cooperating well together.
I want to home in on one of the points you raised, because there is certainly a revolution happening in the finance space with fintech players muscling in on the territory of traditional banks like Nedbank. How do you see the incumbents maintaining their advantage and relevance in the digital world?
Well, I think it's all about the incumbents realizing that in order to be able to provide the customer experience that more digital players are able to do, or digitally native players are able to do, you really do need to do that hard job of completely refreshing your tech stack to enable a digital experience that is at least as good, if not better, than the newcomers, given that banks have materially more product sets and offerings and generally, have much higher levels of trust than the newcomers. So I certainly think that all of the South African banks, and again, I would point to Nedbank in particular, have done a really good job of digitizing their existing businesses and making life incredibly hard for the fintechs who don't want to partner with banks to eventually reach scale.
Having said that, Mike, how hamstrung are you by legacy infrastructure?
So we don't think we're materially hamstrung at all now as a consequence of the more than 10 billion rand that we've spent in a complete refresh of our tech systems to build a modern, agile, modular, and digital tech stack. And in fact, we have the advantage now of that digital tech stack and a customer base of more than 7 million clients and R1 billion balance sheet. So I think we're very strongly positioned to compete extremely powerfully in digital financial services going forward.
Yeah. Mike, you mentioned and alluded to the fact that when you took over at the helm of Nedbank, you were, the world was amidst one banking crisis, right? We've seen another crisis take a hold of the banking world just recently, following the problems, of course, at Credit Suisse, at Silicon Valley Bank. Concerns have been sparked about other banks. South African banks generally seen as conservative, stable. Do we go as far as saying our banks are less exposed to risk than some of their international counterparts? I mean, is that accurate?
I definitely do think that is accurate. We've all become experts in a very short space of time around what we've read about, for example, Silicon Valley Bank. And, I think what you all know in financial services is if there's big movements in markets, interest rate markets, debt markets, in particular, perhaps equity markets, credit markets, in environments that are not used to big movements. In South Africa, we're used to an extraordinary amount of volatility. Globally, they've had record low interest rates for probably 10, 12 years. And now interest rates are normalizing. And in the words of Warren Buffett, when the tide goes out, you get to see who's been swimming naked. And certainly, if you look at in particular what happened at Silicon Valley Bank, it looks like the basics of banking 101 around interest rate risk management was simply ignored. And on top of that, it's always important to remember that our South African big banks are all fully Basel III compliant, which quite simply means you can't hold assets on your balance sheet at accrual accounted values and put them into various liquidity calculations as such. You have to mark them to market. And that was one of the fundamental problems at Silicon Valley Bank.
I've got to ask you then, Mike, what's your take on South Africa's greylisting?
Well, it's clearly an own goal, and we have scored way too many own goals over the last few years, and probably not a surprise to anyone, because I think you just have to look back on a country that underwent what we refer to as state capture, and an extraordinary amount of money laundering in that environment has subsequently become evident, and there's nobody in jail. So I would think somebody like FATF will look at that and say, your system simply doesn't work. However, I guess slightly more positive, at least within the FATF recommendations, there were no findings against the banks or the financial system. The majority of the findings are against our ability to investigate, prosecute money laundering, and cooperate with global money laundering authorities. And just finally, certainly from a Nedbank point of view, in engaging with our correspondent banks, which we've done both pre and post the grey listing, the vast majority of them say quite simply, South Africa was already on their high-risk list since the days of President Zuma and state capture. So they didn't really need to be told 6 years later by FATF to put us on extended due diligence. We were already there.
Yeah. It's in this context, Mike, that you recently called for urgent and decisive leadership on an array of issues to get things back on track locally. And talking tracks, Transnet's woes amongst the lot, but also load shedding, water infrastructure. I mean, the list is endless, right? If you were put in charge of the country, what would you be doing to resolve some of these key issues?
Well, I think you've got to start out by saying, the biggest challenge in South Africa is unemployment. And that has multiple knock-on effects in the social fabric of our society, in fiscal sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. But to sustainably address unemployment, there are three key things that absolutely need focus. You can make a much longer list, but the three key things are energy and electricity, logistics and Transnet, and crime and corruption. So I would be laser focused on resolving those three issues to attract high levels of investment, to drive up economic growth, which in turn will increase employment levels. And in focusing in on those, I think we have to recognize our current reality, which is that state capture not only cost the country a lot of money, it also incapacitated many of government's delivery mechanisms. So the only way to fix those issues is to crowd in the help, experience, and money of the private sector, and to embrace that as a means of improving the lives of all South Africans.
And until we go down that path, right, despite the risk that we're coming up against right now, despite the fact that your experience and expertise could place you anywhere in the world, really, you choose South Africa and continue with a demanding position of running a big bank. Why?
Multiple reasons. For all the challenges that we have, this is still a most amazing country with extraordinary potential. And I think the job of the leaders in our country is to address the challenges that we've got so that our country can reach the extraordinary potential that it has. A top 10, in most important minerals in the world, a huge exporter of agricultural produce, a gateway into Africa with world-class financial services, accounting, legal systems. The list goes on. So I certainly want to play my part in trying to improve the livelihood of all South Africans so that my children and grandchildren want to live in this great country.
Mike, a pleasure catching up with you today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.